There's a sound that the universe makes when something ancient decides it is finally done. It is not loud. That is the cruelest part. It is the sound of wind through an empty cave that used to hold fire. It is the specific silence of a creature who has outlived every single thing that ever made him feel worth existing. Outlived mountains, outlived civilizations, outlived the very language that his name was first spoken in. It is the sound of scales that were once the color of molten copper going gray at the edges, like a photograph left too long in the sun. His name, in the old tongue, translated to something close to "He who makes the sky remember it was once afraid." Now he lay in a crater on the far rim of a world nobody visited anymore, and he cried. Not dramatically, not with fire or thunder or the great heaving sobs that stories always give to dragons when they grieve. He cried the way very old things cry, quietly with total certainty, in a way that had no audience and wanted none. He had been crying for 11 days. The boy found him on the 12th, not because the boy was brave, not because he was chosen or magical or carrying some ancient destiny wrapped in prophecy. He found the dragon because he was 12 years old. He had wandered too far from the colony settlement again, and he had followed what he thought was a weird rock formation because weird rock formations were, in his experience, worth investigating. The dragon was not a rock formation. The dragon was the size of a collapsed building, gray and copper and enormous, and he was crying, and the boy sat down 3 meters away from him and said nothing because even at 12 years old, Eli Vasquez understood one fundamental truth about grief. Sometimes you don't fix it. Sometimes you just stay. This is the story of what happened after that. The dragon's name was Vorathiel, and he had been alive for so long that the concept of being alive had started to feel like a very bad joke someone had told him at the beginning of time and was still waiting for him to laugh at. He remembered when this planet had oceans. Real ones, deep and cold and full of creatures that had no names because nothing had yet evolved to give them names. He had watched those oceans dry over the course of 4,000 years, which, to a creature of his lifespan, was roughly equivalent to watching a puddle evaporate on a warm afternoon. He had not been sad about the oceans. He had simply noted them, the way you note a cloud passing. He had been sadder about the Velhari. The Velhari were the civilization that had built temples to him. Not because he had asked them to. He had actually explicitly told Velhari Elder Karathen that the temple project was unnecessary and slightly embarrassing, but because the Velhari were a people who expressed devotion through architecture, and Vorathiel had, apparently, inspired devotion. They had scales like his. Smaller, obviously. Softer. The kind of scales that didn't survive a plasma cannon, but still caught sunlight in ways that made Vorathiel feel a specific warmth in the part of his chest that was roughly equivalent to what smaller creatures called heart. They were gone now. Had been gone for 600 years. A disease, then a war, then the long arithmetic of extinction that always seemed to end the same way. He had stayed on their world after. He was not sure why. Habit, maybe, or the particular cruelty of memory, which kept showing him things. Karathen's face, the way the temple bells sounded in the dry season wind, the specific pitch of Velhari laughter which had always struck him as too high and too bright and too alive, and refusing to let him put them down. He had started crying somewhere around day 300 of the year after the last Velhari died. He had not really stopped since. The crater he occupied now was on a planet called Serac, 9 on the Galactic Union survey maps, though the Union didn't bother sending ships here because there was nothing profitable about a dead world with cracked red rock and wind that smelled like iron. The Union was efficient that way. They cataloged things by usefulness. Serac, 9. No minerals of value, no habitable zones, no indigenous sentient life. Category, dormant. Status, unmonitored, which was why the human colony was there. Humans Vorathiel had observed in his approximately 400 years of watching them operate across 17 different star systems had a specific relationship with the concept of unmonitored. They treated it like an invitation. They found the places the Union didn't bother with, and they went there with their prefabricated shelters and their seed banks and their children and their inexhaustible, slightly alarming optimism. And they built things. Not always good things, not always smart things, but always aggressively things. The colony on Serac 9 was called Red Rock Station, which Vorthiel found depressingly literal, and it housed approximately 340 humans who had come here for reasons ranging from political exile to religious conviction to simple frontier restlessness. He knew this because he had, in the early days of their arrival 8 years ago, observed them from a distance with the detached professional interest of a very old creature watching a very young species attempt something that statistically shouldn't work. He had not expected to feel anything about them. He had been wrong about that, which was uncomfortable. There was a woman named Dr. Priya Vasquez who ran the colony's medical bay and who had, on 3 separate occasions over 8 years, walked out to the edge of the settlement in the evening and looked toward the distant crater rim where Vorthiel lay and said very quietly to no one visible, "I know you're there. You don't have to hide if you don't want to." She never pushed. She never came closer. She just said it and then went back inside. He had not moved toward her, but he had, on those 3 evenings, stopped crying temporarily, which was, for Vorthiel, nearly equivalent to someone else smiling. Her son was 12 years old and appeared to have inherited her complete absence of self-preservation instinct. Vorthiel had been lying in the crater for 11 days when the boy appeared on the ridge above him. He heard him before he saw him. Small boots on loose rock, the particular scrambling sound of a child who has climbed something he shouldn't have and has committed too fully to the climb to back down now. Then a shower of small pebbles. Then a boy-shaped silhouette against the orange sky. The boy looked at him for a long moment. Vorthiel, who had not moved in 11 days, did not move now. He was in the technical sense enormous. 40 meters from nose to tail. Wingspan that could cover the colony's main square twice over. Scales that were copper and gray and, in the last decade, increasingly the color of ash at the edges, which he did not think about, because thinking about it meant thinking about what it meant. His eyes were amber gold, the color of something fossilized, and they were wet. He was crying, quietly, steadily, the way a very old wound seeps. The boy climbed down into the crater with the determined, scrambling energy of someone who had decided, partway through a decision, that there was no dignified way out and the only option was forward. He half-slid the last 3 meters and landed in a crouch on the crater floor, looked up at Vorthiel, and then sat down cross-legged in the red dust approximately 3 meters away. He said nothing. Vorthiel waited for him to say something, because in his experience, every creature that approached him said something. Usually it was a request. Sometimes it was a threat. Occasionally it was a speech about destiny or prophecy or the great burden of being the last of one's kind, which Vorthiel found deeply irritating because the creatures giving those speeches were invariably not the last of their kind and had no operational understanding of what that actually felt like. The boy sat. The wind moved across the crater. The boy pulled something from his jacket pocket, a battered notebook, actual paper, which struck Vorthiel as an extravagant anachronism for a colony child, and opened it and began drawing something. He was drawing Vorthiel. Not well. The proportions were wrong in ways that suggested the boy understood that the proportions were wrong and was drawing them wrong on purpose, with the specific creative confidence of someone who has decided that artistic accuracy is less interesting than artistic expression. The dragon in the notebook had enormous eyes and a slightly comic curve to his neck, and wings that looked like they belonged to a creature trying very hard to be majestic and not entirely succeeding. Vorthiel looked at the drawing. Something happened in his chest that he did not have a word for, which was notable because he had words in 47 languages, living and dead for almost everything. "You should not be here," Vorthiel said. His voice, when he used it, sounded like boulders consulting each other. He had not spoken in 11 days, and the disuse showed. The boy looked up. He did not startle, which was statistically improbable. "I know," he said. "Mom's going to be mad." That is not the primary concern I had in mind. I know that too. The boy looked back at his notebook. You've been out here a while. 11 days. Is that a normal amount of time for you to be out here? Vorthiel considered this. I've been out here in various forms of out here for approximately 600 years. The boy's pencil stopped. He looked up again. His eyes were very dark brown, almost black, and they held the particular quality of a person who is listening in a way that goes past the ears. 600 years alone. Longer than that. Alone is a recent condition. The boy was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of not knowing what to say. The quiet of knowing exactly what to say and choosing when to say it. Vorthiel found this unusual in a 12-year-old. That sounds really bad, the boy said finally. It is, said Vorthiel, without inflection. The boy nodded slowly. He did not say he was sorry. He did not say it would be okay. He did not offer a solution or a plan or a reason for optimism. He just nodded with the solemn weight of someone receiving information they intend to take seriously and went back to drawing. Vorthiel watched him draw. The wind came through the crater again, carrying red dust and the faint iron smell. The orange sun was starting to descend toward the horizon. In maybe an hour it would be dark and cold in ways that were not safe for a human child who had evidently not thought to bring a jacket rated for Sirac 9's nights. What is your name? Vorthiel asked. Eli. A pause. Eli Vasquez. He had not made that connection until this moment, which meant he was slower than he used to be, which he also did not think about. Your mother is the doctor. Eli looked up, and something changed in his expression, a kind of pleased surprise, like someone who has just discovered that a thing they hoped for is real. You know her? I have observed her. She talks about you. At dinner sometimes. She says there's a dragon out here, and everyone else thinks she made it up for the kids, but she doesn't talk about things she made up. He said this with absolute conviction. The loyalty of it was uncomplicated and total. She says you seem sad. Vorthiel was quiet. Are you? Eli asked. Sad. The amber gold eyes moved from the notebook to the boy's face. Vorthiel held the question for a moment like a stone he was turning over, examining its weight. I'm the last of my kind, he said. I have watched 43 civilizations end. I have had in my life 7 individuals I would describe as friends. Not acquaintances, not allies, but friends. And all 7 are gone, some for thousands of years, some for centuries, one for 11 days. I am alive, which increasingly feels like something that is happening to me rather than something I am doing. So, a pause. Yes, I am sad. Eli absorbed this. He closed his notebook. He put it back in his jacket pocket. He looked at Vorthiel with those dark, serious eyes, and he said, My dad died last year. On the supply run from Vega Station. It was a ship thing. Engine thing. Mom doesn't say it straight out, but I know. He picked up a small red rock from the crater floor and turned it over in his fingers. I was really sad. I'm still really sad. I kind of learned that being sad and being okay aren't opposites. You can be both. Vorthiel looked at this 12-year-old human boy sitting in the red dust of a dead planet. That is, he said very carefully, a remarkably sophisticated understanding. Ili shrakit. Mom says grief is just love with nowhere to go. I think about that a lot. Grief is just love with nowhere to go. Vorthiel held that sentence in his mind the way his chest held fire, slowly, with great care, aware of its heat. He had not thought of it that way. In 600 years, in 47 languages, in all his enormous catalog of words and concepts and philosophies accumulated across centuries of observing civilizations rise and burn and go quiet, he had not thought of it that way. The sun dropped another degree toward the horizon. The temperature was falling. He could feel it in the way he felt all temperatures, distantly, academically, like a fact rather than a sensation. But the boy, in his insufficient jacket, was starting to hold his arms slightly closer to his body. You will be cold soon, Vorthiel said. Yeah. Eli did not sound particularly concerned about this, which was, in Vorthiel's assessment, a very human response to a practical problem. Vorthiel considered. He had not offered warmth to another creature in 11 days. He had, in fact, not offered anything to another creature in 11 days because the thing that had died 11 days ago had been the last creature he had offered things to, and the offering had not been enough, and that was a fact he had been sitting within the crater while the colony 3 kilometers away went about its bright, small human business. He exhaled, not fire, a warm exhale, the kind that came from deep in the chamber of him, where his internal temperature ran hotter than any surface on this planet. It moved across the crater floor in a gentle wave, warming the air in a 3-meter radius centered on the boy. Eli looked up. His expression was not fear. His expression was the specific delight of someone who has just received a gift they didn't know they needed. "Oh," he said softly. "Thank you. You should still go back before full dark," Vorothiel said. "The rocks are not safe to climb without light." "I know." Eli stood, brushing red dust from his pants. He looked at Vorothiel for a moment. "Can I come back tomorrow?" Every cell in Vorothiel's ancient body told him to say no. Said, "This is how it starts. You let something in, and then it ends. It always ends. You have buried 7 friends and 43 civilizations, and you have never once been the one who got buried, and that is the taxonomy of your life. You remain, they go, and every time you let something in, you are only building the next 11 days of lying in a crater." "Yes," Vorothiel said. He was not sure why. He suspected he knew why. Eli climbed out of the crater with the same determined, scrambling energy that had brought him in. At the top of the rim, he stopped and turned back. "Her name was Soriel," Vorothiel said, without planning to say it. "The one who died 11 days ago. She was the last Velhari-descended creature in this galaxy. She was 640 years old, and she laughed too loudly, and she was my friend." Eli stood at the rim. The orange sky behind him was going purple at the edges. "Soriel," he repeated, like he was learning the name. "Keeping it. She sounds like she was good." "She was," said Vorothiel. "She was very good. Ili nodded. Went." Vorothiel lay in the crater and watched the sky go from purple to black and fill up slowly with stars, and he thought about a 12-year-old boy's drawing of him. Proportions wrong, wings too big, eyes enormous, and he thought about grief being love with nowhere to go, and he thought about Soriel, and for the first time in 11 days, the crying stopped. Not because he was better, because somewhere for the first time in a very long time, the love had somewhere small to go. The stars came out over Serac, 9, cold and ancient and indifferent, and Vorothiel lay beneath them and breathed and waited for morning with something he had almost forgotten the feeling of. Something that was not quite hope, but was perhaps the crack in the ground that hope grows out of. 3 kilometers away, in a prefabricated shelter with lights warm against the dark, Dr. Priya Vasquez was sitting at her kitchen table when her son came in from the cold, smelling of red dust, and something warm that she could not identify, something like stone heated by an internal sun. She looked at him. "The dragon's name is Vorothiel," Eli said, sitting down across from her. "He's been alone for 600 years. He said I can come back tomorrow." Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me everything." And Eli did. And the night moved around the small, bright shelter, and in the crater 3 kilometers away, the last dragon in this corner of the galaxy breathed warm air into cold darkness and did not, for the first time in 11 days, cry. It was a small thing. It was in the arithmetic of very long grief, everything. Eli came back the next morning. He came back the morning after that, and the one after that. By the 6th consecutive morning, Vorothiel had stopped being surprised by the sound of small boots on loose rock, and had started, in a way he did not examine too closely, arranging himself to make the climb easier, shifting his position so that the slope on the eastern side of the crater was less steep, his body providing a kind of windbreak that warmed the approach path. He told himself this was simply efficiency. He did not want the boy to fall and injure himself before reaching the bottom, because an injured boy would attract attention, and attention was not something Vorothiel wanted. This was not entirely untrue. It was also not the whole truth. Eli brought things. Not gifts exactly. He brought them the way a person brings things when they're thinking about you and want you to know it without having to say it directly, which Vorthiel recognized as a specifically human dialect of affection that he had observed in the Velhari as well, and in two other species before that, and which always made him feel the same specific warmth in his chest that he had no tidy vocabulary for. The first thing Eli brought was a thermos of coffee that he'd made himself, too strong, the way coffee made by people who don't drink coffee usually is, and he sat on a rock near Vorthiel's head and said, "I know you can't drink it, but Mom always says the smell of coffee is its own thing." Which was true. The smell rose into the cold morning air, and Vorthiel breathed it, and it smelled like something alive and domestic and warm. "Your mother is perceptive," Vorthiel said. "She says the same thing about you." The second thing Eli brought was his notebook, which now had 3 new drawings of Vorthiel, each one slightly more accurate than the last, the eyes staying too large, but everything else moving toward proportion. He showed them without being asked. Vorthiel looked at each one without comment, and then said, "The wings are still wrong." "I know." Eli turned to a blank page. "Can you show me?" Vorthiel looked at him. "I am 40 meters long. Can you, extend one? Just part way?" He could. He hadn't. In 11 days, plus, however, long before that, extended his wings with any purpose other than keeping rain off himself. He extended the left one now, slowly, a partial unfurl that nonetheless darkened the crater floor below it. The wingspan, even a half extension, was considerable. He heard Eli's breath catch, not in fear, in the specific register of a person receiving more beauty than they were expecting. "Oh," Eli said softly, and started drawing. He drew for 20 minutes, while Vorthiel held the wing extended, which was more patience than he'd exercised for anyone in years. The drawing that resulted was still not technically accurate, but something in it had changed. The wing in the drawing had weight now, had atmosphere. Eli had somehow caught the quality of the light through the membrane. "Better," Vorthiel said. Eli grinned with all his teeth. It was a lot of teeth relative to the size of his face. It was a grin that operated at a volume disproportionate to its owner, and it was, Vorthiel noted, absolutely identical to his mother's smile. They talked in those early mornings. Vorthiel had not talked in decades in any sustained way. He had communicated, occasionally, with Union survey ships that wandered too close, which was its own cold exchange of information with no warmth in it, and he found that talking required a kind of reopening, the way a long-unused door requires pressure before it swings. Eli did not push the door. He simply sat near it. The door opened on its own schedule. Vorthiel told him things. Not the big things, not yet. He told him smaller things first, the way you build a fire, small pieces of dry wood before the logs. He told him about a planet he'd visited once that had 3 simultaneous sunsets in different colors because of the atmospheric composition, and how he'd spent 6 hours watching them overlap. He told him about a species he'd encountered near the galactic rim that communicated entirely through bioluminescent patterns on their skin, like living Morse code, and how their language had no word for war, but 17 different words for different kinds of rain. He told him about the time he'd gotten caught in a gravitational anomaly between 2 neutron stars, and had spent what he calculated was 3 subjective weeks tumbling through a region of space where his normal sense of direction simply ceased to apply. "Were you scared?" Eli asked. "I was disoriented," Vorthiel said. "Scared implies an expectation of death. I had survived enough by then to not particularly expect death from any given situation." "What does scare you then?" The question sat in the crater air. Vorthiel turned it over. "Forgetting," he said finally. "I have outlived things that no other living creature remembers. When I am gone, there will be no record. Not of the Velhari, not of the 3 sunset planet, not of the bioluminescent people who had 17 words for rain. The galaxy will continue, and the things that were will be as though they were not." A pause. "That frightens me." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he opened his notebook to a new page and wrote, in his slightly chaotic 12-year-old handwriting, "The Velhari, the 3 sunset planet, the rain language people." He looked up. "I wrote them down. Now I know. So if you go first, I remember. And I can tell someone else, and they can tell someone else." He looked back at the page. That's how things survive. Vorthiel looked at the boy and the notebook. He had, in the last 600 years, considered legacy in the abstract, the philosophical question of what persists when a thing is gone. He had never once thought that legacy might look like a 12-year-old with a battered notebook and a slightly too strong thermos of coffee, writing names down in the red dust of a forgotten world. You are, Vorthiel said carefully, a very unusual child. Mom says that too. She doesn't mean it as a compliment. Edo. The grin again. All the teeth. The colony, it turned out, had noticed that Eli was going somewhere. In a settlement of 340 people on a dead planet with no entertainment infrastructure, the activity of one 12-year-old boy was not a private matter. By the end of the first week, 6 other colony children had attempted to follow Eli to see where he went every morning. He had, with a combination of strategic misdirection and sheer speed across broken terrain, successfully lost 5 of them. The 6th, a 13-year-old girl named Phoebe Okafor Walsh, who ran faster than Eli and had apparently decided that following him was a personal challenge he could not shake. Phoebe arrived at the crater rim on the 7th day and stood there for a full minute looking down at Vorthiel with an expression that Vorthiel classified as extreme data processing. She was taller than Eli, darker-skinned, with the kind of face that was currently performing complex threat assessment behind a surface of absolute calm. "Ah," she said. "Hi," said Eli, from the crater floor. "This is Vorthiel." "I know what a dragon is," Phoebe said. She was already climbing down. She sat 2 meters from Vorthiel, slightly closer than Eli had sat on that first day, and looked at him with direct, assessing eyes. "Can you breathe fire?" "Yes," said Vorthiel. "How hot?" "Approximately 900 degrees Celsius at the source. Cools with distance." Phoebe pulled a notebook of her own from her bag. Unlike Eli's battered paper one, hers was a digital pad, neat and organized with color-coded sections. "I'm going to have questions," she said. "A lot of questions. Is that okay?" Vorthiel considered. "It depends on the questions. Science ones mostly. Biology, atmospheric chemistry, xenobiology." She was already writing something. "My dad's a structural engineer, and my mom's a botanist, but I'm going to be a xenobiologist. Except I've never had a live specimen to study." "No offense." "Specimen," Vorthiel repeated. "She doesn't mean it like that," Eli said quickly. "I kind of do mean it like that," Phoebe said. "But also like, respectfully, the way a scientist means it. You're incredible. You're a 40-meter self-heating organism that's been alive long enough to watch moons change orbit. Every biologist in the galaxy would trade a limb to sit here. I'm not being weird. I'm being accurate." Vorthiel looked at her for a long moment. "You may ask your questions," he said. What followed, over the next several mornings, was one of the stranger experiences of Vorthiel's recent decades. Phoebe arrived each day with a new set of questions, organized by category, and worked through them with the systematic thoroughness of a scientist twice her age. She asked about his cellular regeneration rate, his metabolic processes, his internal temperature regulation, his sensory range. She asked how his wings processed atmospheric data. She asked about his immune response and whether he had something analogous to a nervous system. He answered because the questions were intelligent and because answering them required him to think about himself in ways he hadn't for centuries, not as a thing that was tired and old and waiting, but as a thing that was, from an empirical standpoint, genuinely remarkable. This was, he recognized, Phoebe's specific gift. She made things feel remarkable by being precisely, rigorously interested in them. Eli's gift was different. Eli made things feel held. 2 gifts, entirely different shapes, equally necessary. Other children found the crater over the following 2 weeks. Not all of them stayed. Some came once, looked at Vorthiel with expressions ranging from terror to confusion, and did not return, which was fine. But a handful stayed. A 9-year-old named Marcus who barely spoke, but who brought rocks to show Vorthiel every morning, holding them up with the gravity of a museum curator presenting artifacts. A set of 11-year-old twins named Hannah and Jun Takahashi Reed, who communicated with each other in a private shorthand of half-sentences, and who seemed to have decided collectively that Vorathiel was their personal territory to defend from any adult interference. A 14-year-old named Rowan Veltri who brought books, actual physical books from the colony's library, and read passages aloud to Vorathiel in the early mornings, not asking his opinion, just reading, the way a person reads to someone who is very ill or very old. Vorathiel had not been read to in 400 years. The last time, it had been Karath Sin, the Velhari elder, reading from the Velhari Book of Origins in the original ceremonial language, a sound like wind instruments in a stone room. Rowan read in standard English from a battered paperback collection of Earth poetry, which was not the same thing. He did not mind the difference. He minded it less than he expected to. Priya Vasquez came to the crater on the 14th day, not as her children's mother, though she was that. She came as a doctor, alone, in the early evening when the children were back at the settlement, carrying a medical bag over one shoulder with the professional ease of someone who had learned a long time ago that emergencies don't schedule themselves. She climbed down into the crater and stood in front of Vorathiel, and she looked at him the way she had looked toward him 3 times before from the settlement's edge, directly, without flinching, with the particular steadiness of someone who has decided that the thing in front of them deserves to be looked at straight. Eli says you're losing color at your edges, she said. He's been describing it in enough anatomical detail that I want to see it myself. May I? Vorathiel regarded her. You are a human doctor. I'm a doctor. I don't have patients that look like you, but anatomy is anatomy, and cellular degeneration is cellular degeneration. She paused. You don't have to let me. But Eli is worried, and when Eli is worried, he doesn't sleep, and when he doesn't sleep, he ends up making terrible coffee at 4 in the morning, and I've had enough of it. Something moved in Vorathiel's expression that might, on a smaller face, have been called a smile. He lowered his head to the crater floor. She walked toward him and put her hand on the side of his face, near the jaw, where the scales were the color of cooling ash at the edges. Her hand was very small against him. She pressed with her fingertips the way a doctor presses, methodical, reading the information under her touch. How long has this been happening? She asked. The discoloration? Several decades. The rate of change has accelerated in the last 5 years. Priya was quiet, pressing reading. Is it painful? It is not painful. Is it irreversible? Vorathiel held the question for a moment. Probably. She withdrew her hand and looked at him, and her eyes, dark brown, Eli's eyes, the same quality of listening that went past the ears, held something that was not pity. Pity he would have recognized and rejected. It was something closer to the look a good doctor gives when they have heard a difficult diagnosis and are deciding how to carry it without dropping it. Okay, she said. Then we work with what we have. She sat down on the crater floor in the red dust, cross-legged, the medical bag between her knees. Tell me what helps. Not medically. Just what helps. Vorathiel looked at this woman in the red dust of a dead world. Your son's drawings, he said. The questions the other girl asks. The rocks the small boy brings. The one who reads. A pause. The coffee smell, even though I can't drink it. Priya nodded slowly. She reached in her medical bag and pulled out a thermos, set on the rock near his head, the same rock where Eli always placed his. I made it properly this time, she said. None of that 4 a.m. rocket fuel. The smell rose into the evening air, warm and dark and alive. Your son, Vorathiel said, told me that grief is love with nowhere to go. He said it was your words. Priya was quiet for a moment. He remembers everything. Yes, he does. Vorathiel looked at her steadily. He wrote the names of things down so that they would not be forgotten. Your son did that. Priya looked at the crater floor. When she looked back up, her eyes were bright. He said you've been alone for 600 years, she said. Yes. You don't have to be anymore. The sentence was simple. It did not carry any of the weight of a promise she didn't know how to keep. It was not a cure or a solution or an answer to the arithmetic of mortality. It was simply a statement of current conditions, offered with the matter-of-fact steadiness of a doctor who has learned to say hard things clearly. Vorathiel breathed. warm air into the cooling evening. No, he said. I suppose I don't. The stars began to appear. The colony lights came on 3 kilometers away, small and warm against the dark. In the crater of very old dragon, and the colony doctor sat in comfortable quiet, and the thermos of properly made coffee slowly cooled between them, and neither of them said anything for a long time because nothing needed to be said. The crack in the ground had opened a little further. Something was growing. The Galactic Union sent a ship on a Tuesday. Red Rock Station tracked it on their long-range scanner 3 days before it arrived. A mid-class survey vessel called the GUS Meridian, flying the Union's administrative green, running a route that had no official explanation in any of the colony's supply manifests. The colony's communications officer, a man named Tadashi Okafor Walsh, who happened to be Phoebe's father and who had the specific wariness of someone who had come to an unwatched corner of the galaxy, specifically because he preferred it unwatched, flagged it to Priya immediately. They're running an asset verification sweep, he said, showing her the signal pattern on his screen. That's not a supply run. That's someone checking on something. Priya looked at the signal. She had been colony administrator, technically, for 3 years. The title had been pressed on her because she was the most organized person in the settlement, and because no one else wanted it. And she had spent those 3 years maintaining a successful policy she privately called aggressive normalcy. Nothing unusual to report. Nothing remarkable about Sirac 9. Category, dormant. Status, unmonitored. Do they know about Vorthiel? She asked. They'd have records from his initial catalog entry, whenever that was. They may not know he's actively present here. And if they do know, Tadashi was quiet. They both understood what Union asset verification meant. The Union was 68 member species across 400 inhabited worlds, and it ran on the premise that all significant entities within its jurisdiction were cataloged, classified, and managed. A 40-meter living dragon of an extinct species, possessing abilities that no current xenobiology database fully documented, on a planet classified as dormant and unmonitored? That was exactly the kind of thing that became a management problem. Priya told Eli that evening. She told him the way she told him hard things, directly without softening the edges, because he was 12 and had already learned that softened edges were how adults condescended to children about things that affected them. He sat at the kitchen table and listened and then asked 3 questions in the specific order that revealed how his mind was processing. What do they want? What can they do? What can we do? The next morning, he went to the crater early, before the other children. Vorthiel knew something was wrong before Eli reached the bottom of the slope. He could read it in the energy of the climb, less scramble, more weight. Eli sat down in his usual spot and did not open his notebook and did not say anything for a full 2 minutes, which was unprecedented. Tell me, said Vorthiel. Eli told him. Vorthiel listened without moving. His amber gold eyes tracked the boy's face throughout, a habit he developed over the past weeks, reading the small human expressions the way he used to read atmospheric data for the information they carried beneath the surface content. I know of the Union's asset protocols, Vorthiel said when Eli finished. I have avoided them for a long time. They're going to want to what? Take you somewhere? Catalog you. At minimum, catalog. Potentially relocate. Possibly. And this is the scenario they would frame as conservation, and I would frame as imprisonment. House me in a Union xenobiological facility. For study. For preservation. The word sat in the crater air like something heavy dropped. I have spent 600 years making my own choices about where to be and when to move. I am aware that the Union would find this an inefficient allocation of a significant biological asset. Eli was quiet for a moment. Can it make you go? He asked. Like physically? Can they actually force you? Vorthiel considered this with honest analysis. A mid-class survey vessel carries standard compliance arrays, which would be ineffective against my physical resistance. However, the Union has protocols for significant uncooperative assets. They would escalate. Larger ships, containment technology one have not encountered in my current state. He paused, and, more relevantly, I am not what I was. 600 years ago, I would have welcomed them to try. Now, he did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Eli had seen the gray at the edges. Eli understod. We have 3 days, Eli said. Yes. The boy stood up. He was not running. He was moving with a specific purposefulness that Vorathiel had begun to recognize as Eli's version of a decision having been made, a kind of forward lean, a set to his shoulders that said he had identified a direction and was committing to it. I need to talk to Phoebe, he said. Why Phoebe? Because she knows things. Different things than me. He was already climbing. Don't go anywhere. I have not gone anywhere in 11 weeks, Vorathiel pointed out. Good. Keep not going anywhere. He reached the rim, turned back. I'm going to fix this. Vorathiel watched him go. He did not tell Eli that the situation was probably not fixable. He had lived long enough to know the difference between problems that had solutions and problems that had only different shapes of loss. And the Union was a bureaucracy with interstellar reach, and Vorathiel was one very old, very tired dragon on a classified dormant planet with 340 humans who had no legal standing to advocate for him. But he had also, in the last 11 weeks, revised several long-held certainties. He was revising them cautiously, with the scientific caution of someone who has been wrong before, but revising them nonetheless. Phoebe arrived 2 hours later. She climbed down with Eli beside her, and she had her digital pad out before she hit the crater floor, and she sat down and looked at Vorathiel with her standard assessing expression and said, Okay, I've been thinking about this since Eli told me, and I have a plan, but you're not going to like it. Tell me, said Vorathiel. The Union's asset protocols have one exemption. 1. Article 7, Section 3 of a non-terrestrial sapient entities charter. A sapient entity with documented significant cultural or historical ties to a member species or settlement cannot be relocated without the consent of that member group. She turned her pad to show him the text, which she had pulled from the Union's public legal database in what must have been approximately 90 minutes of research. The key phrase is documented significant cultural or historical ties. Vorathiel looked at the text. I have no documented ties to a human settlement. I have no ties to humans at all in the Union record. You do now, Eli said. He held up his notebook. I've been documenting for weeks. Everything you've told me. Every conversation. Every drawing. Phoebe held up her pad. I have 43 pages of xenobiological data. Temperature readings, structural observations, behavioral notes. It's not peer-reviewed, but it's systematic. It's a record. Vorathiel looked between them. We need something formal, Phoebe said. The personal notebooks help, but they don't constitute a legal documentation of community ties. We need the colony to formally recognize you as, okay, this is the part you're not going to like, as a protected cultural entity associated with Red Rock Station. That requires a community vote, Vorathiel said. It requires a community meeting, Phoebe corrected. Mom says in small colonies under the charter, community meetings with unanimous or near-unanimous agreement carry provisional legal weight pending formal review. We get enough people in a room to agree. We submit the record to the Union's regional office before the Meridian lands, and suddenly they don't have a clear asset. They have a protected entity in an active cultural relationship with a recognized human settlement. Vorathiel absorbed this. It was, from a legal standpoint, thin. He had centuries of experience watching legal standpoints operate in the galaxy, and thin was the charitable assessment. The Union had lawyers. The Union had protocols. The Union had, when it wanted something, a very efficient machine for getting it. But thin was not the same as nothing. There's another factor, Vorathiel said carefully. For the cultural ties argument to hold, I would need to be visible, present, physically located within proximity of the settlement, not 3 kilometers away in a crater. He paused. I would need to be in a colony. Eli and Phoebe looked at each other. Yeah, Eli said. We know. The colony meeting happened that evening in the main common room, which was the largest space in Red Rock Station, and which, at full capacity, held approximately 200 people at managed discomfort. The children, Eli, Phoebe, Marcus, the twins, Rowan, sat in a row near the front with the specific posture of people who have spent the day preparing and know exactly what they want to say. Priya ran the meeting because Priya ran most things by default, which she was privately tired of, but which was not the primary concern of the evening. She explained the situation, the Union ship, the asset protocols, the charter exemption, the plan. The room was quiet for about 4 seconds. Then it was not quiet. Vorathiel, 3 kilometers away in his crater, could hear the meeting. Not the individual words, the human voice didn't carry that far at that frequency, but the shape of it, the rise and fall of collective human speech when people were arguing about something they cared about. He lay in the crater and listened to the distant shapeless sound of 300 humans deciding what mattered. He had heard that sound before. Different species, different scales, different planets. He knew what it meant. It meant they were alive. Actually, aggressively, inconveniently alive in a way that mattered. The dissent was real, and he understood it. A woman named Ortega, who ran the colony's agricultural section, argued that sheltering a dragon from Union oversight put the entire settlement's charter status at risk. If the Union decided Red Rock Station was in violation of asset protocols, they could revoke the settlement's legal standing. 340 people could lose their home. A man named Delacroix said he had not come to the edge of nowhere to import new problems, and that they didn't know enough about the dragon to make commitments to him. A father of 2 whose name Vorathiel didn't know said that his children went out to that crater every morning, and he'd spent 3 weeks wondering if he should stop them, and he hadn't because they came back different, lighter somehow, more full, and that meant something. Back and forth, the shape of it, in the dark from 3 kilometers away. Then one voice, high and clear and carrying the particular authority of someone who has decided they're done being quiet. Ili. Vorathiel could not hear the words. He did not need to. He knew the cadence, the way Eli spoke when he had thought something through and was delivering it from the specific depth of having actually meant it. Not performance, not argument, just truth given directly. The meeting went quiet, stayed quiet for a moment. Then, a sound that was not argument. An hour later, Eli arrived at the crater rim with a flashlight and slightly out of breath and said, "Unanimous. We got unanimous." Vorathiel was quiet for a moment. "Ortega," he said. "She wants to talk to you herself. She said if she's putting her settlement on the line for you, she gets to decide for herself whether you're worth it." Eli was grinning, even exhausted. I said, "Okay." And Delacroix? Eli's grin did a complicated thing. He said, and I'm quoting, "I still don't like it, but the kids went out there every morning for 11 weeks, and nothing bad happened, and I'm not going to be the man who votes against the kids." He paused. It counts. It counted. It counted in the way that imperfect things count. Not because everyone had been convinced, not because the objections had been answered, but because 340 people on a dead planet had looked at a problem and decided to lean into it together anyway. "There is something I must tell you," Vorathiel said. "Ili voitit. I may not be relocatable. In my current condition, moving from the crater to the settlement boundary would require physical effort I have not expended in some time. I do not know, with certainty, that I can make the walk." Eli absorbed this. His face did not collapse or panic. It did the thing it did. Went into that listening stillness, the love with nowhere to go, briefly finding where to go. "Then we go slow," he said. "And if you need to stop, we stop. And if you can't make it all the way, we figure out what to do from wherever you end up." That is not a plan. That's exactly a plan. Vorathiel looked at the boy in the flashlight's edge. 12 years old. His father's death 11 months ago in his eyes if you knew how to look. The love with nowhere to go, finding its way. "All right," Vorathiel said. He stood. It took longer than it once would have. His legs found their place beneath him with the careful deliberateness of something working against its own weight. He stretched, slowly, the wings going out partway, the neck extending, the whole enormous length of him realigning with the effort of having been still too long. Eli watched, and his expression held something that was not pity and was not fear, but was the specific quality of a witness. Someone watching something matter, and knowing it, and not looking away. "Ready?" Eli asked. "No," Vorathiel said. "Let's go." They moved through the dark together, the boy with his flashlight making a small, warm circle on the red rock, and the dragon 40 meters of ancient copperin, ash beside him, step by careful step toward the small, bright lights of Red Rock Station in the distance. The stars overhead were cold and indifferent as they always were. They moved anyway. The GUS Meridian set down on Sirac 9 surface at 0900 hours, and Union Commander Desta Ferreira walked out of the landing ramp into the Red Rock morning, expecting to conduct an asset verification survey on an unmonitored dormant world, and instead found 340 humans standing at the edge of their settlement in a loose semicircle. A 12-year-old boy standing slightly in front of all of them, and a 40-meter dragon sitting behind the boy like a very large, very old mountain that had recently decided to relocate. She stopped at the bottom of her ramp for a full 10 seconds. Then, she said to the junior officer beside her, "Get me legal on the comm." She was not a bad person, Desta Ferreira. Vorathiel had made a career, if career was the right word for 600 years of observation, of distinguishing between bad people and people who had learned to run on institutional autopilot. And she was firmly the second kind. She had short gray hair and the specific posture of someone who had spent decades making systems work and had made her peace with the fact that systems were not always kind. She carried a data pad with the Union's asset verification protocols loaded, and she was processing the scene in front of her with the visible effort of someone who has arrived prepared for one situation and is recalculating for another. She walked to Eli, not to Priya, not to any of the adults. She looked at the configuration, the boy in front, slightly ahead, the dragon behind, and made an accurate assessment of the social structure she'd walked into. "You're the spokesperson?" she said to Eli. "I'm one of them," Eli said. He had been up since 4 in the morning, and it showed in the dark under his eyes, but his voice had that quality it got when he'd made a decision, steady and deep like something anchored. "This is Administrator Vasquez." He indicated his mother. "And Dr. Phoebe Okafor Walsh is our documentation coordinator." Phoebe, beside him, inclined her head with the specific calm of someone who had decided that 13 was old enough for this. "Dr. Okafor Walsh," Ferreira repeated, and something in her expression did a small, complicated movement. Recognition, maybe, that she was being formally handled by children competently. "Commander Ferreira," Phoebe said, "before we proceed with your asset verification, I'd like to submit our advanced documentation under Charter Article 7, Section 3. You should have received the digital submission from our communications officer last night." Ferreira looked at her pad. She had received it. 43 pages of xenobiological documentation, 11 weeks of recorded interactions, a formal community vote with signed attestation from 268 of Red Rock Station's adult residents. The rest were children or the handful of adults who had not voted against but had preferred to abstain rather than commit, and a 12-page legal brief written by a colonist named Abaydin Oyelerin who had, in a previous life before Sirac 9, been a Union legal aid attorney. Ferreira read for longer than was comfortable for anyone watching. Vorathiel, from his position behind the assembled colony, watched Commander Ferreira read. He had spent centuries observing the faces of authority, encountering complications they hadn't planned for. He was reading her the way he read atmospheric data, for the truth beneath the surface pressure. She was surprised, not by the dragon's existence. She'd had the survey record. She was surprised by the documentation, by its quality, by the fact that it was, legally speaking, coherent. She was surprised by the children. "I need to verify the entity's status directly," she said finally, looking up from the pad toward Vorathiel. "Of course," Priya said. Ferreira walked toward Vorathiel. She stopped at approximately 5 meters, the same instinctual distance most people stopped at, and looked up at him with the assessing directness of a professional. "Vorathiel," she said, "you're listed in the Union Xenobiological Survey as a Dracthali class entity, species designation extinct, last confirmed location. Interestingly, this sector approximately 200 years ago." "I move periodically," Vorathiel said. "Your species is the only one classified at cognitive tier 9 in the survey record." full sapience, cultural memory retention, extended lifespan. She glanced at her pad. The record also notes that previous Union contact attempts resulted in, and I'm quoting, non-cooperation consistent with an entity operating outside Union jurisdiction by personal choice. That is accurate. She looked at him steadily. The Union's position has historically been that entities of your classification are assets of significant scientific value that require documentation, monitoring, and, where necessary, protective management. The Union's position has historically been incorrect about a number of things, Vorthiel said pleasantly. I can provide examples, if that would be helpful. Ferreira's mouth did a small thing that was not quite a smile. The Article 7, Section 3 submission complicates my mission parameters, she said, without inflection. That was the intent, Phoebe said from beside Eli. Ferreira looked at the 13-year-old who had said this. Who wrote the legal brief? She asked. Mr. O'Yelleran. Priya indicated him, a tall man in his 50s who raised one hand briefly from the back of the crowd. Former Union Legal Aid, Regional Office. Ferreira looked at O'Yelleran, looked at the pad, looked at Vorthiel, looked at Eli, who was watching her with those dark brown, serious eyes that went past the ears. I need to make some calls, she said. She went back to her ship. She was in there for 2 hours. 2 hours is a long time to stand in Red Rock wind with 340 people and not know how it's going to go. Vorthiel watched the colony wait. He watched the way they organized their waiting. Someone produced a portable heating unit and set it up for the children. Somebody else, improbably, produced coffee. Marcus came and stood beside Vorthiel's front left leg and leaned against it with the absolute trust of a 9-year-old who has decided that this is a safe thing to do. The twins stood behind him, making up a private commentary in their half-sentence language that Vorthiel couldn't follow, but which seemed, from their expressions, to involve detailed opinions about Commander Ferreira's fashion choices. Ortega, the agricultural director who had opposed the plan at the meeting, walked to the front of the crowd and stood near Eli. She did not say anything. She was just there with the solid, uncommunicative presence of someone who has made a decision and is standing by it. Eli felt her arrive and looked up at her. She looked down at him. I still think this is probably going to create administrative headaches for the next 5 years, she said. Probably, Eli agreed. Worth it, she said, and looked back at the ship. Vorthiel filed this away, stored it in the place where he kept the things that mattered. Not because they were grand or ancient or historically significant, but because they were true. A woman who thought the plan was risky, standing at the front of the crowd anyway. The world had always been built on that. On the people who thought it was risky and showed up anyway. Commander Ferreira came back out at 1100 hours. She had a different expression now. Not exactly softer. More considered. Like someone who has been presented with a genuinely difficult problem and has decided how to engage with it honestly. She walked to Priya. Not to Eli this time, to the administrator. The Article 7, Section 3 submission is legally valid, she said. Our regional legal office confirms that a community attestation of this size and quality meets the provisional threshold. I can't remove or relocate the entity without triggering a review process that would take, conservatively, 8 to 14 months. A pause. I also can't simply leave without any record. What I can do is submit this as a pending protected status case, which means the entity's location is documented as associated with Red Rock Station, and any further union action requires a formal hearing with your settlement represented. The crowd was very quiet. That's a yes. Eli asked. Ferreira looked at him. That is a procedurally complicated yes that comes with significant administrative requirements for your settlement going forward, including quarterly documentation reports and a formal annual review. We can do that, Phoebe said immediately. Ferreira looked at the 13-year-old with a digital pad. Yes, she said, and this time the thing her mouth did was definitely a small smile. I believe you can. She looked at Vorthiel. You understand what this means? You're not free of union oversight. You're documented, associated. You have responsibilities in this framework. I have had responsibilities before, Vorthiel said, to a people called the Velhari. I was not always adequate to them. I intend to be adequate now. Ferreira was quiet for a moment. The Velhari are in the Union's extinct species record, she said carefully. Yes, you knew them. I knew their last elder. I knew their last descendant. I was with the last descendant when she died, 11 weeks ago. Her name was Soriel. He held the name out into the red rock air, clearly, so it carried. She was 640 years old, and she laughed too loudly, and she was my friend. Ferreira looked at him for a long moment. Then, she did something that Vorathiel did not expect from a Union commander running an asset verification protocol. She took out her data pad, opened a record entry, and typed the name. Soriel. For the historical record, she said quietly. Name should be in the record. Something moved through Vorathiel's chest, that specific warmth he still had no word for in any of his 47 languages. Eli, beside him, reached up and put his hand on Vorathiel's leg, just his palm flat against the scales. Not a dramatic gesture, not a performance, just a hand placed there because it felt right. Vorathiel felt it. After Ferreira's ship departed, provisionally with documentation filed and the pending case number transmitted to the regional office, the colony dispersed slowly, the way crowds do when the crisis is past and reality is reasserting itself. People drifted back to their work, their children, their prefabricated shelters, and their seed banks, and their coffee, and their daily small businesses of staying alive. Ilistith. They sat together in the space just at the edge of the settlement, where the colony buildings gave way to open red rock, and the afternoon sun sat orange and heavy in the sky. Eli had his notebook out, not drawing, just turning the pages through all the drawings he'd made over 11 weeks. Vorathiel studying the wings. Vorathiel's eyes, the curve of his neck. Soriel's name, written at the top of the first page in careful letters, because Eli had asked her name that first night and had written it down that night in his notebook before he went to sleep. Vorathiel saw it. He had not seen it before, had not thought to look. It was at the very top of the page, before the drawings, before any of it. Soriel. Eli had written it the first night. He'd been keeping her since before he'd known anything else. You wrote her name first, Vorathiel said. Eli looked at the page. Yeah, she was why you were sad. She seemed important. He shrugged slightly. She was important. She's still important. Vorathiel looked at this boy, 12 years old, a battered notebook, a dead father whose name he also probably had written somewhere in those pages. 340 people who had, in the course of 2 hours, decided to stand in the wind on a dead planet and argue with the Galactic Union on behalf of an old dragon they'd known for 11 weeks. Eli, Vorathiel said, yeah, I would like to tell you about the Velhari. Properly, not the small pieces I've given you. The whole of them. Their language, their temples, their history, the way Karath-Sen laughed, and the way the bells sounded in the dry season. He paused. It will take some time. Eli turned to a blank page. Uncapped his pencil. I've got time, he said. So Vorathiel told him. He told him about the Velhari the way he had never told anyone. Completely, from the beginning, from the first moment he had encountered their ancestors on a world that had since been eaten by its own sun. He told him about the scale shimmer that caught light the same way as did, and how that it felt the first time he had seen it, like being recognized in a mirror he'd had no idea existed. He told him about Karath-Sen, who had been wise in the specific way that incorporated silliness, who had once spent an entire political summit arguing with foreign dignitaries about the correct way to prepare a ceremonial dish because he believed that the correct way to prepare the ceremonial dish was genuinely important and was not willing to let it go. He told him about Soriel, who had been born 640 years after her civilization's extinction and had been the only one of her kind and had somehow made peace with that in a way that Vorathiel, with centuries of additional experience, still could not. He told him about the last morning, what Soriel had said, what they had looked at together, how the light had been. Eli wrote and listened and wrote. The sun moved across the sky and went orange and then red. Phoebe arrived at some point and sat beside Eli and listened to her pad recording. Rowan came and brought his book but didn't open it, just sat and listened. Marcus came and leaned against Vorthiel's leg again, and fell asleep there partway through the Velhari history. They stayed until the stars came out, and Vorthiel talked and talked and talked, 600 years of accumulated silence finally, finding somewhere to go. The love with nowhere to go. Going. 3 years later, Eli was 15, and Phoebe was 16, and the gray at Vorthiel's edges had spread. Not dramatically, not all at once. The way seasons move so gradually that you only notice when you look at a memory and compare it to now. The color at the tips of his wings, which had been the rich copper of old coins when Eli first climbed down into the crater, was the color of winter ash now. His movements in the mornings, which had once been slow from disuse and mood, were slow now in a different way, the way of something working against its own weight with increasing effort. He did not talk about it. He did not need to. Priya noticed it, the way doctors notice things, not only when examining, but always at dinner across the settlement square, in the quality of his breath when she brought coffee in the evenings. She noted it and said nothing in the way of alarm, and said everything in the way of attention. Phoebe documented it. She had been documenting systematically for 3 years now, and her xenobiological records of Vorthiel had grown from 43 pages to approximately 400, organized with the rigorous affection of someone who loved the subject of her study, without being confused about what love required. The documentation was the love. Accurate, honest, not softened. Illiteral. He had 37 notebooks now. He had been working on the 38th since March. The drawings had changed, more accurate, technically, though they'd kept something the earliest ones had, that quality of the eyes too large, and the wings catching light in ways that weren't anatomically precise, but were somehow true. He had also, over 3 years, filled pages and pages with words. Not just names, though there were hundreds of names now, every species and place and person Vorthiel had mentioned cataloged carefully, but stories. Full accounts in Eli's slightly chaotic handwriting that had improved, but not normalized, of everything Vorthiel had told him. There were 63 Velhari stories in Eli's notebooks. He knew the names of 42 individual Velhari. He knew the dry season bell schedule. He knew how to say, "I am grateful" in the old Velhari ceremonial tongue, because Vorthiel had taught him, and he had practiced until it sounded correct. The Velhari had been extinct for 600 years. 63 of their stories were alive, in a 15-year-old's notebooks on a dead planet, in the handwriting of a boy who had followed a weird rock formation into a crater and found something to save. The Union Review hearing happened in the second year, and Abiodun Oyeleran handled it from Red Rock Station's side with the competence of a man who had waited his entire legal career for a case this interesting. The protected status was confirmed. Vorthiel was, in the Union's formal record, a protected cultural entity, Class A, associated with Red Rock Station, Serac 9. The annual review requirement stood, and Phoebe ran it with such thoroughness that the Union's Xenobiological Review Board, which was used to receiving perfunctory compliance forms, had twice sent back letters asking if the submitting researcher was available for consultation. She was 15. She said yes, and the consultations were conducted via long-range comm, and 2 senior xenobiologists at the review board had subsequently updated their published work based on things a teenager had told them. She had not pointed this out to anyone at school, but she and Eli had celebrated privately with the terrible coffee that Eli still made at 4 in the morning when he couldn't sleep. The colony had changed around Vorthiel too. Not consciously, not by policy, but in the quiet way that communities change when something becomes part of them. Children grew up knowing Vorthiel as a fact of their world, not a wonder to be amazed by, though he was that, but a neighbor, a large, old, unusual neighbor who breathed warm air and occasionally told stories and did not want to be treated like a museum exhibit. The adults who had been skeptical in the beginning had not all become converts to enthusiasm, but they had moved by increments from opposition to a kind of resigned acknowledgement that then slowly became something else. Ortega still maintained that the administrative headaches were considerable. She also had, over 3 years, gotten into the habit of leaving a container of coffee at the settlement's edge every morning in addition to whatever Priya or Eli brought. She had never acknowledged doing this. Vorthiel had never acknowledged receiving it. It happened every day. Communication existed that did not require words. He had learned that about humans. In the third year, something happened that Vorthiel had not anticipated, which was unusual because in 600 years he had anticipated most things. A ship arrived that was not the Union's quarterly review vessel. It was a smaller ship, private registration, with markings that Vorthiel recognized after a long moment of searching through layers of memory, a glyph that had belonged to a people called the Orth, who had been, 3 centuries ago, spacefaring neighbors of the Velhari. The Orth had not gone extinct. The Orth had gone quiet, retreated from galactic activity for reasons that were cultural and internal, and that Vorthiel had never had the complete story of. He had not seen their markings in 250 years. The ship's occupant was a woman, or the nearest Orth equivalent of a woman, which was not a perfect translation, but was the direction of it. She had the specific pale gold coloring of Orth skin and the large luminous eyes of a species evolved in low-light conditions, and she walked out of her ship into Serac 9's red morning with the careful deliberateness of someone walking into a situation they have prepared for. She found the colony first, asked for the dragon, was brought to him by Eli, who had been at the settlement perimeter doing morning drawings when the ship landed, and who had, with the specific social instinct he developed over 3 years of being Vorthiel's de facto ambassador, recognized that this arrival required handling. Vorthiel, the woman said, when she stood before him. Her voice had the quality of the old Orth formal register, ceremonial, structured, learned rather than native. She had prepared this greeting. I am Sale of the Orth returning. We have been watching the Union broadcasts. We saw your name in the protected status filing. A pause. We did not know you were still alive. Vorthiel looked at her. The Orth, he said carefully, withdrew from galactic communication 250 years ago. We withdrew, Sale said. We did not cease. She looked at him steadily. We went away to survive intact. We have come back because we are ready, because something moved in her expression, because we heard that someone was documenting things that should not be forgotten, and we have things that should not be forgotten, and we did not know how to begin. And then we saw your name and the name of the Velhari in a Union document submitted by a human settlement on a dead planet, and we thought. She paused again. We thought. Perhaps here. Eli, beside Vorthiel, was very still. The Velhari and the Orth were neighbors, Eli said quietly. Not a question. He knew. He had the 63 stories. Sale looked at him. The Velhari were. They were dear to us. When they ended, we did not speak of it. We could not. She looked back at Vorthiel. You knew them. You knew Karath Sen. I knew him, Vorthiel said. I knew his descendants. I knew the last of them. Soriel, Sale said. The name, in this woman's mouth, sounded different. Not wrong. Different like hearing a melody played in a different key. Still the same melody, recognizable, whole. Soriel, Vorthiel confirmed. Sale was quiet for a moment. Then, she reached into the bag she carried and withdrew something, a small flat object, disc-shaped, made of a dark material that caught light in familiar ways. She held it out. This was a Velhari making, she said. We have kept several in our archives. I thought, someone should have this who would know what it was. Eli stepped forward before Vorthiel moved. He received the disc with both hands. The careful way he received things he understood were important. He looked at it, at the design on its surface, which was geometric, detailed, the kind of craftwork that took patience and belief in permanence. There are symbols, he said. I don't know this script. It is the old Velhari ceremonial script, Sale said. Eli looked up at Vorthiel. I know it, Vorthiel said. There was a moment. Then Eli held the disc out toward Vorthiel, not giving it back, offering it for reading. The way you hold a book open for someone who wants to read aloud. Vorthiel lowered his head. Read? The script on the disc was old even by his standards. It predated Karath Sen by several generations. It read, We made this for the one who remembers us, so that we may be remembered by more than one. He held the sentence in his mind. They made it for him. Centuries ago, they had known the Velhari in the way that people who live closely alongside something vast sometimes understand it better than it understands itself. They had known that he would outlive them, and that would be hard, and that he would need eventually to give the memory away. They had made him a thing to help with that. It had taken 600 years, and a 12-year-old with a notebook, and 340 humans on a dead planet to complete the transaction. He said, very quietly, in the Velhari ceremonial tongue, I remember you. You are not gone. Eli, who knew the response, who had practiced it, who had said, teach me everything, said it with him in Karathsen's language, haltingly but correctly. I remember you. You are not gone. Sail's hand came up to cover her mouth. The Orth did not cry the way humans did. But something happened in her large, luminous eyes that was the equivalent of it. A brightness, a fullness, a thing that had been held a very long time, finding a moment to be released. Phoebe, arriving from the direction of the settlement with her pad, and her organized questions and her systematic love that she expressed through rigor, stopped when she saw the scene and read it correctly in approximately 4 seconds, and closed her mouth on whatever she'd been about to say, and stood there with the rest of them. What happened over the following weeks was not dramatic, in a way that the most important things are often not dramatic. Sail stayed, not permanently, but long enough. She had stories. The colony had practiced listening to stories. Eli filled 6 more notebooks. Phoebe formally opened a documentation collaboration with the Orth returning, which was the name they had given their reemergence, and which would eventually become the first formal human-Orth cultural exchange program in the Union's record. Vorthiel rested more than he used to. He talked more than he had in centuries, because the talking was the point now. Each conversation an act of distribution, of spreading the weight of everything he'd been carrying across more hands than one. He told Eli things he'd been saving. He told Sail things he hadn't said to anyone. He told Phoebe the things she needed for her documentation, and more besides. One morning, very early, before the colony was awake, Eli came to sit with Vorthiel in the cold pre-dawn dark. No notebook, no drawings. He just came and sat and was there the way he had been on the first day, 3 meters away, quiet, not trying to fix anything. The gray was at his face now, at the edges of his jaw. Are you scared? Eli asked. It was the same question he'd asked in the early weeks, in another configuration. Vorthiel recognized it. Of forgetting, he said. No, not anymore. Eli was quiet. Everything I remember, Vorthiel said, is in your notebooks. In Phoebe's documentation. In the things the Orth are recording. In the things you have told other people, who have told other people. The 3 sunset planet. The rain language people. The Velhari bells in the dry season. He breathed slowly, warm air into the cold dark. Soriel. Soriel, Eli said quietly. The memory is not in me anymore. It is in the world. That is better. A pause. That is what she wanted. When Karathsen's people made that disc, that is what they wanted. They did not want it buried in one old creature who would outlive everything. They wanted it distributed, alive in many places. He looked at Eli. You did that. Eli looked at the red rock and the stars above it. You did that, he said back. You let me. They sat together in the pre-dawn dark and watched the sky go from black to purple to the specific orange that meant Serac 9 sun was clearing the horizon. The colony lights came on one by one. The smell of properly made coffee drifted from the direction of the settlement. Ortega's contribution, placed at the perimeter as always, reliable as seasons. Marcus arrived at some point, because Marcus always arrived eventually, and sat against Vorthiel's leg and fell asleep there with the absolute trust he had always had. The twins appeared on the eastern ridge and stood together making commentary in their private language, and even from this distance their expressions said something about light and morning and being alive. Rowan came with a book. Phoebe came with her pad. Priya came with coffee and sat beside her son and leaned her shoulder against his and said nothing because nothing needed saying. They were all there. Vorthiel looked at them, this small, improbable collection of humans on a dead planet, this community that had grown up around something they had chosen to love, and he felt at the edges of him where the gray had spread, not the diminishing he had expected, but something else. Warmth. Not his own. Not the internal fire he'd carried for millennia. The warmth of proximity. Of people nearby. Of love that had found somewhere to go, and kept going, and would keep going after him, distributed through notebooks and documentation and the stories people told each other across years and light years. He had been afraid, for a long time, that being the last meant being a dead end. He had been wrong. He was not a dead end. He was a beginning. The Velhari had known it when they made the disc. Eli had known it that first day, when he sat down in the red dust and said nothing but stayed. Priya had known it when she stood at the settlement's edge 3 times and said you don't have to hide. They had all known what Vorthiel had spent 600 years unable to believe. That love does not end when the one it's for is gone. That love becomes a record. A record becomes a story. A story becomes a name in a child's notebook. And a name in a child's notebook is read aloud by that child to their children, and their children to their children on worlds that have never heard the dry season bells and never seen the scale shimmer in the light, but who know the way you know a song you've never learned, in the specific resonance of being human and being alive and understanding what it means to have loved something, who know that the Velhari were here, that Soriel was here, that a dragon named Vorthiel lay in a crater on a dead planet for 11 days and cried quietly as the universe made the sound it makes when something ancient considers being done. And then a boy sat near him, and the universe made a different sound. Small, warm, improbable. The sound of love finding somewhere new to go. The stars faded in a morning, one by one, the way stars always do. Not going dark, but being outcompete by something brighter and closer. The colony lit up around them. The day began on Serac 9, which was a dead world that had somehow become, by the specific stubborn intervention of 340 humans and one old dragon and a handful of children who had decided that what mattered quite thoroughly alive. Eli opened his 38th notebook. He began to write.